Hello, historians. Today we are talking about Arizona physiography. And as always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Cherland. Today, we're going to learn about the physical makeup of the state of Arizona. That's how we're going to start with this class. So throughout this lecture, you're going to see several illustrations, maps, or otherwise interpretations of the state's geography, flora and fauna, and topography, which is kind of a combination of aspects, which is why we call it Arizona physiography. And you're going to have a challenge. You have an assignment to complete alongside the lecture. You're going to download the Arizona State Map Challenge. Now, you can access this in the assignment, or you can access it right here in the Google Slides. Either one is perfectly fine. And let me show you what it looks like. So this is your State Map Challenge. You can see we start with a blank state, and on the left are 40 aspects: geographical, topographical, landmarks, things like that. Most of them are about the physical makeup of the state itself. I want you to identify all 40 of those things on the state map. I'm not going to walk you through each of these one by one in order. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about the physiographical makeup of our state. And I want you to try and track as you go how and where these locations kind of make sense on the state map. So you'll see lots of illustrations in the lecture, but you're also welcome to use Google Earth or Google Maps. You're welcome to use image search. You can really use any resources at your disposal to complete this map. But I do encourage you to start with the lecture, because not only do I go through most of these things, I've also done the map myself. Now, I used to assign way more than 40, right? This is like 75 spaces. So this is kind of what, I'll show you what my final map looks like. So it really does look like a ton of stuff, right? It's all representative, and it's mentioned either in the lecture or in some of the additional research you might do. There are 40 locations on this map, and the closer you get to 40, the closer you get to 100%. So think of it that way. And again, use the lecture, use other resources, and you're welcome to work with a partner if you like in order to complete this assignment. So you're going to go to that map, that link, you're going to print it or save it to your desktop. As you saw from mine, I use just sort of black marker, pencil, and black pen. Some students really get creative. They want to use colored pencils and markers, and they want to make it really colorful. Other students have attempted, not with great success, to do sort of a graphic design manipulation on their computer. You can try to do that. That's fine with me, but it's not always been the easiest route for students. The easiest for most is to print it and handwrite along. So that's up to you. You're going to follow along with the lecture, and you're going to identify as many locations, terms, and key aspects as discussed in the Arizona map. And then after the lecture, you'll conduct additional research as needed. And if I haven't mentioned it already, yes, you may work with a partner, and you may use additional resources at your disposal. So before we start, just think to yourself. You don't have to write it down. You don't have to share it with anybody. You don't have to tell me the answer. But before you even begin this lecture today, what do you already know about the state of Arizona? I want you to brainstorm 5 things. And if you need to stop and pause the recording, that's perfectly fine. But just jot down maybe in a notebook or in front of you, wherever, what are some things you already know about the state of Arizona? Now, my hope is that by the end of today's lecture, you're going to learn more than 5 things. And you're going to learn a lot over the course of the next semester and the rest of our time together as a class, because we're going to have lots of assignments that do these kinds of things. Not only are you going to learn about the state as a whole, you're going to learn a little bit about local history and how to embed it or make it contextualized in larger state significance. So today's lecture is going to today's lecture is going to cover the following things. Locating Arizona. Where is it on the map? We might take for granted where it is on the map, but maybe you don't even know. You've just kind of lived here your whole life and never really considered its geographical placement. We're going to look at something unique to the state of Arizona, which is major geographical zones. And we'll talk about what those are. We'll discuss principal geographical landmarks, the obvious being like the Grand Canyon, the Sonoran Desert. We'll look at all of those. We'll discuss Arizona ecology, both plants and animals. And I use that term ecology intentionally, and I have a little reason for it later on in the lecture. We'll discuss Arizona weather. It's not just dry, it's not just hot, it's actually a very diverse state. And we'll end with a discussion of Arizona geology. Now, when we're discussing all 6 of those elements, we're going to be talking about different points on the map. So I will do my best to kind of slow down and really focus or emphasize certain things, but you can always pause the recording if you need to pause it and jot down on your map what you're working on. All right, let's get started. So Paleo Indians, who were also known as Native Americans or ancient Arizonans, roamed the American Southwest over 10,000 years ago. Now, many of them did leave artifacts behind as proof of their existence, including, I don't know if you've ever been up on South Mountain, but there are just hundreds of petroglyphs carved into the mountains by the Huhugam. We sometimes call them the Hohokam, right? And that is evidence of people having lived in the Southwest at this time. But there's no real documented or recorded history that translates to kind of modern audiences until the arrival of the Spanish in the 1400s, the 15th century. Because of this, historians have had to use geography, right? Prehistoric geography to really chart together the story of the state. But we also rely on oral testimony and tradition. So lots of oral histories, which comes into play a lot in the study of Arizona, that we have used and relied upon. Things like oral testimony passed down through generations of generations through groups like the Otham people or the Navajo, the Hopi, right? Other groups that have been really central to Arizona's development from the beginning. When we meet again, we will talk way more about these people. We will discuss people. History really is a study of human beings. So that's what we're going to focus on. But let's set the stage today in terms of locating Arizona. So where does Arizona begin? Where does Arizona begin? Before the time of man, Arizona's unique geography, flora, and fauna were already under development through the work of ancient fault lines and weather patterns. You know, it's been said that if you don't like where you're at in Arizona, you could just drive 10 miles in a different direction and you'd see something completely different. And it's very true. The state begins, I'm going to use my annotation tool as best I can to sort of help you out a little bit here. All right. So the state begins really up here in the Four Corner area. So the Four Corners is the meeting point of Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. So this is the Four Corners right here. In the Four Corners, we have the Painted Desert, which I kind of identified as sort of this area right here. It's not on this particular map. We have the Canyon de Chelly, the Navajo and the Hopi reservations, which are up here. You might see it in another map. And we've got a forest. There's forest all up here. We've got, we've got the Hoover Dam, which is over here. We've got the Cactus Belt, which ultimately stretches all the way to the New Mexico border. We're going to cover each of these areas. So if you're starting to feel already a little bit behind, don't. I'm just kind of giving you a brief introduction. Let's start with those physiographic zones that I mentioned to you. Major geographic zones or physiographic zones. You can call them either physiographic or major. I'm going to go into depth on each of these zones. So I will talk about the plateau zone, the mountain zone, and the desert or basin and range, and you'll see each of those represented as their own slide. So just look generally at the map right now. 3 zones, the plateau, the mountain, and the desert and or basin. Immediately as you see this topographical map, where do you want to guess the plateau is? Where do you want to guess the mountain zone is? And where do you want to guess the desert or the basin range is? So I don't know if you're starting to see it, but let me draw you some circles that might help you kind of begin to interpret where the state's physiographic zones begin and end. Let's do little circles. So the easiest one to probably identify is the mountain zone. Because if you think about the way maps represent mountains, they tend to be these kind of like, do you see these like wavy lines kind of represented here. And maybe what I'll do is use the annotation tool again so that you can just see that. So like right here, these little wavy lines out kind of dips around like this. We'll talk about the mountain zone as well, but that may be the easiest one to identify because on the map, it's represented in those kind of bumpies. The basin and range, if you think about a basin of a sink, right? Or the basin of a toilet or the basin of a tub, it's where it sort of sinks down. This might give you an impression that this is the basin range, right? Because you kind of see that it's supposed to represent, it looks a little lower than the rest. Whereas up here is the plateau zone. A plateau, we'll talk about in a moment, is kind of a lifted landmass. So let's discuss each of these physiographic zones. So here you go. If you just want to pause right here and identify where the plateau is, where the mountain zone, which is also sometimes called the transitional zone, and the basin and range. But let's talk about the plateau zone. And I'm going to give you examples of each of these things. The plateau zone is this giant landmass that is a space of lifted up territory up here, all around here, this green area. And it extends. So the plateau is called the Colorado Plateau. It is a space, a geographical space that is shared by Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. So it's not distinct to Arizona. What makes it distinct in Arizona is its relationship to the other zones, right? So the Colorado Plateau, or just the Plateau zone, includes the Arizona Strip, the Grand Canyon, the San Francisco Mountains, the Painted Desert, Canyon de Chelly, Black Mesa, the Kaibab Plateau, and Monument Valley. It's basically the northeastern corner of the state, but about a third of it. So let's look at some examples. The Grand Canyon, probably the most famous landmark in all of Arizona. This exists in the Plateau Zone. The San Francisco Peaks, always known as an icon in Arizona as well. This is also in the Plateau Zone, kind of right in the middle north part of the state. The Painted Desert, Canyon de Chelly, Black Mesa, which is near the Hopi Reservation, the Kaibab Plateau. Isn't that beautiful? Do you think of Arizona when you see that? Would you have immediately thought, I bet that's in Arizona? And Monument Valley. Now, Monument Valley is another iconographic location in Arizona. The Plateau Zone is, without a doubt, the most dramatic and spectacular collection of geography and scenic diversity, possibly in the country, but definitely in the state. So now let's talk about the mountain zone. Again, look at this map. Now, I chose this map. I know it's ever so slightly blurry, so it's probably not helpful in terms of locating specific locations, but I just thought this was such a good map to show you those mountains that really are right, kind of cutting diagonally halfway through the state. This is called the mountain zone. It's also called the transitional zone. And let's see if I can draw you just a line. It looks like a big kind of lazy S, starting at the kind of up by the Hoover Dam almost, and then continuing all the way into the Mexican border. In this zone, it's called the mountain zone for a reason. There are over 30 mountain ranges. Most are about 4,000 to 6,000 feet in elevation, and they're all separate from each other. So I grew up in Colorado, right? So I think about the mountains as like the Rocky Mountains that you think of in Colorado, that are just like one big spine down the middle of the state, and in some ways the middle of the country, not the middle of the west of the country, right? Arizona is very unique in that we don't have this like one strip of mountains. We have kind of this curving S of little pockets of mountains that are a little shorter. 6,000 feet in elevation is not as big as some of those 14,000 feet mountains in Colorado, for example. So what this does is it creates biological islands, spaces that are unique or distinct from each other in those portions of the state. So different types of squirrels, perhaps, or mice might form in these areas, unique from each other. The mountain zone is home to the Mogollon Rim. Look at that beautiful picture, that big long stretch of blue. That's the Mogollon Rim. And you can see why it's a rim and not a peak, right? It's home to the White Mountains. If you think of the areas near like Payson and a little bit further east and north. And it's home to the gorgeous Oak Creek Canyon. That's near Sedona. Another map that really shows you kind of the differences between those zones. The plateau is up higher, but just ever so slightly flatter. Then you've got your mountain zone that kind of transitions the part of the state. And then to the bottom left, you have the basin and range where things kind of sink down ever so slightly. Now, the desert zone, also called the basin and range. I prefer basin and range in part because it connects to sort of other geographical and topographical titles throughout the country, but you can call it either. Basin and range or desert zone is totally up to you. This is cactus country, right? This is really the cactus belt or the cactus collection in Arizona and also most of North America. We have broad, arid valleys that are flanked by stark mountains. So again, look at the way the map is representing mountains for you here. In the transitional zone, you have a lot of these like densely darkened uprising mountains. So the darker it gets, the higher it gets, right? So you have a lot of them all together in the mountain zone. But down here in the basin and range where we're talking about, you can see there's lots of mountains. They're just kind of spread throughout. So whereas the transitional zone has lots of mountains and they're a little higher, in the basin and range, there's more height and more diversity. So there's more height and more valley, more height, more valley. That's a little bit different from the transitional zone. The desert zone is frankly known for its searing heat and nocturnal critters, meaning people and animals that just come out at night mostly or live in air conditioning about 6 months of the year. The reason people can live in the basin and range is because of irrigation, canals, and reservoirs, which provide water and electricity to all the people like us living in Phoenix. And it's really strange because the desert is frankly somewhat uninhabitable, for humans, except for air conditioning, electricity, and irrigation. And that's all man-made. And yet 90% of Arizonans live in the desert zone. I wonder if that surprises you. Let's take a look at some of the best known landmarks of the desert and basin and range. So we are home to the Sonoran Desert, which is one of the largest in the world, and I believe the largest in North America. It stretches from parts of California and Arizona into a large swath throughout Mexico. We are also the meeting place of the Sonoran and the Chihuahua deserts. This occurs, you'll see another map in a moment as to where these overlaps are. So it's well known, obviously, for its desert. It derives its name from the North and South Mountain valleys, right? So those kind of desert or basin and range. And this is the Salt River, which is essentially what brings water and electricity to where we live in Phoenix, if you're living in Phoenix while you're watching this video. So let's talk about the geographical landmarks. Now, here's a great map. You might pause it here and take a look a little bit more at some of the major features that I've pointed out. Again, this map shows us a little bit less of that distinction between the transitional zone, but you still see it. And this map artist likely thought that this was more of a transitional zone than a mountain zone. They may have chosen that emphasis because think about how it goes from this kind of yellow gold and then sort of transitions or fades into this more green kind of depth of color. So check your map. Look at all of these things. On here, I have identified, or I've used a map that identifies for you several major landmarks that I want you to find. Here's the Colorado Plateau. Here's Humphreys Peak. Here's Flagstaff. Here's the Little Colorado, the Grand Canyon, right? The Grand Canyon, you could do the park or the canyon itself. Phoenix, obviously, the Gila River, the Salt River. Remember I said the desert and range is a basin and range is where the Gila and the Salt Rivers meet. So that should give you some pretty good ideas as the Mogollon Rim, right? As to several major elements that I want you to identify on this map. But what makes a desert a desert? Like, why do we classify something as a desert? Well, for obvious reasons, it's dry. Evaporation rates in our desert in Arizona are at least twice as high as precipitation rates. So every drop of rain we get, we lose too. So that's a pretty stark reality when you live in the desert. A desert is typically classified as an area with less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. But deserts get a bad rap. Many people see them as mysterious, but at best, and uninhabitable at worst. Do you remember what desert we live in? We live in the Sonoran Desert. This is typically like the backdrop of classic old Western movies, kind of the image of the Lone Range, the open West. But we also have an extensive amount of desert flora and fauna. The hard land, though, has molded some of the most magnificent plants and animals into life, and I want to show a few of those to you. That's because the sandy soil that makes up the basin and range, or the desert zone, whichever you call it, has really led to kind of a curation of uniqueness in the desert. So the ocotillo, for example, this kind of spindly bush-looking cactus, the agave, the palo verde, meaning green bark, palo verde, right? The yucca, and the saguaro, of course. These are unique to the Sonoran Desert. This combination of flora and fauna is unique to the Southwest and unique to the Sonoran Desert. This is a place, the Sonoran Desert is a place where humans have to adhere to the land or attempt to conquer it. So think about that mention I said, that it's kind of uninhabitable without air conditioning, electricity, and irrigation, so access to water. So Arizonans, particularly those living in the Phoenix area, have really had to conquer, right, nature. They've really had to adapt and attempt to conquer nature. Let's talk a little bit about animals. And I use the word ecology intentionally. Do any of you know what the school of ecology is? What is ecology? Where was it founded? All right, so ecology is fascinating. Basically, ecology is the study of plants and animals and their interactions with their physical environment based sort of on elevation. And it was introduced in Arizona in the 1890s by this guy named Clinton Hart Merriam. So what Merriam found, which was really, really fascinating, was that truly, in really one of the only places on Earth where you could do this was Arizona. You could actually see all aspects of sort of the zones of life just in Arizona alone. It's really remarkable. So Hart Merriam, his theory was a theory of life zones based on the effect of temperature, right? And plants and animals, how they react with each other. He found that a change in elevation of about 1,000 feet was about the same as traveling 300 miles north and south in Arizona. So for example, if he were to take a trip from the Yuma Valley, that kind of at the very bottom corner of the map, let's look at it real quick. Okay, so if you were to take a trip from the Yuma Valley here, okay, and you wanted to go all the way to the top of the San Francisco peaks, right? And Humphreys Peak is one of the San Francisco peaks. So look at the distinction of space that you're going to cover if you were to go on that journey alone. And what Miriam found was that you would go through all 7 ecological life zones if you were to do that. So this is what he's identifying in this map. So from desert all the way to plateau or to peak, right? From a dry tropical environment to the Arctic alpine. Very few places on Earth can attest to this. This is very unique to Arizona. And like I said, Arizona kind of gets a bad rap. It's kind of seen as this sort of desert place. And sure, as you can see on this map, the desert accounts for nearly half of our state, that kind of purple representation. That's about half of the state. But we also have woodland forests up here that's represented in kind of a green, right? And we have grasslands. So everything else is kind of grassland. We are home to nearly 3,500 species of plants, from the towering ponderosa pines, which you'd find in Flagstaff, to teeny tiny grasses. So would you have guessed on the left that that was an Arizona tree, or on the right that those were Arizona trees, right? We are home to Joshua trees, yucca, and then on the right, like teeny tiny, think of the grasses that grow on a golf course, those teeny tiny little Bermuda grasses. Another thing that's cool about Arizona is 60% of all types of wildlife in North America can be found in our state alone. Another unique aspect, right? We have 10 types of big game, for example, elk, bear, mountain lions, like that. And then we have roadrunners and Gila monsters and javelina. I mean, it is a very unique place when it comes to animals. Arizona's placement on the map. Now look at where Arizona is. It's kind of right here where you see the Colorado Plateau and the Sonoran Desert come together, right? This is a biological extension of the Chihuahua and Sonoran Deserts of Mexico. It is the meeting point of the Mojave Desert and the Rocky Mountains. So this map shows you the Rocky Mountains and the Mojave Desert. It's also a meeting point of the Great Plains and the Sierra Nevada. So wow, right? I mean, look at how unique our area of the map is. If I were to draw you kind of a loose circle of where Arizona is, it's like right here. Look how many things come together all in this space compared to other major states in the United States. But it's a dry heat, right? But it's a dry heat, right? Have you ever heard people say that? Arizona was not actually always dry. So let's talk a little bit about Arizona's weather patterns. During the 1970s, for example, Arizona was hit with a series of so-called 100-year floods that wiped out buildings and bridges all along the Salt River Valley. Our wet seasons, there are actually two wet seasons. One is kind of this January, December, February, right? Kind of a light rain, cloudy, overcast, sort of moderate. It's very lovely, very cool. And this is a reference to a weather pattern that occurs this way. From the months of December, January, and February, storm systems move east from the Pacific Ocean and then dip down, which then covers the state with sort of a typical gentle rain, very mild. But you might be thinking of a different wet season, right? You're probably thinking of the dramatic and exciting and sometimes destructive monsoon season. This is a violent season that arrives in mid-July and usually lasts through September. Some seasons are very wet and some seasons are very dry. Totally different weather pattern, right? Here's what happens. Storms are usually caused by a high pressure system that kind of starts in that Four Corners area. And then the system sort of builds moisture and turns into the Gulf of Mexico. So very much further east than where we are. And then what happens, so as the storm system is building, warm air from the desert, because it's summertime, is rising and the two pressure systems meet and they clash. Now, I'm not a meteorologist, but that's the best I can do to describe that to you. As those two, the warm air from the desert and the moist, cool air meet, it provides a very brief but very heavy rainfall, along with spectacular lightning, thunder, and dust storms. I love this picture because this is sort of a picture of Arizona if Arizona were boiled down into a year. So this gives us an idea, right, of just how old Arizona is. If you were to just look at each of these landmarks, right, you could look up how old they are. 30 to 50 million years old, 80 to 110 million years old, 150 to 190 million years old, and the Vermilion Cliffs, which we believe are 190 to 200 million years old. Arizona has some of the oldest geological structures, right? I mean, in the West for sure. Okay, so it's really hard to really break down 4.5 billion years for you. So think it in terms of 1 year. If Arizona were only alive for 1 year or only existed for 1 year, let's compress that and say from, say, January to about mid-August, the Earth is evolving as just sort of a gaseous, large sphere and ultimately forming algae in the ocean. So those first 8 months, all it is gases and algae, basically. But then Only 2 or 3 weeks later, the Grand Canyon becomes formed. That's how old the Grand Canyon is. It's pretty remarkable. So Grand Canyon is fused in about August. Then by November, fish are swimming in the Colorado River. And then dinosaurs show up in about December. So where are the humans? If we were to condense Arizona history into 1 year, all of that would be happening and humans would arrive really late on New Year's Eve. That's how young human beings are when it comes to the state of the world, right? We're young in terms of geological and archaeological evidence. So Arizona's shape is very old, right? And it really began to form, though, during the most recent age, and that is the Cenozoic age. In that time, Arizona has gone through many changes. Volcanoes erupted. So you saw that picture of the San Francisco peaks. San Francisco peaks used to be one peak, and that was this one peak, and it was a volcano. But then volcanoes erupted and created additional mountains and mountain ranges that then softened or wore away over time. Dry lands ultimately became seas or lakes or the alternative. Many of our highest mountains were a result of molten rock that was cast upward from the depths of the earth, sort of those shifting tectonic plates. That's how South Mountain was formed. And the highest and most awesome in terms of our state are the San Francisco and Flagstaff. They once rose to the height of 15,000 feet, and geologists were able to provide a layer by layer record through those peaks, but also through the Grand Canyon. So what's cool about the Grand Canyon is it provides, let's go back to this. It provides that layer by layer, almost like a vertical mile. So it goes down a mile and you can see all of these layers in the canyon. There are so many things to learn about Arizona in terms of history, but also geology, geography, and topography. But when we meet again, we will discuss even more about the people who made up the origins of this state. Here's another map. Feel free to pause on it, get as many things as you can. Now, before I send you off to complete your challenge, your map challenge, I want to show you how I cite sources, and I'm going to be expecting you to do the same. So all of these images I found with just a simple Google search. If I was doing kind of more of a professional presentation, or if I was turning this assignment in, I would include citations for each resource. But instead, I'm going to show you where I got my content. So all of my content today I got from Tom Sheridan's Arizona, which is a book I will reference consistently throughout our time together. And I want you to notice there are 4 elements identified in this citation, and I'm going to expect the same from you every time you cite something. Author, Tom Sheridan. Title, Arizona. Location is the press. So this is a physical book, and it was published by the University of Arizona. And then date, it was published in 2012. Now, if you're using a web source, that's perfectly fine. You still need author, title, and date. And the location is just that link, that URL where you found that material. If you just cut and paste the URL, you're not giving me a citation. You're just showing me where you found it. I still don't know who wrote it. I still don't know when it was done. And I still don't know what it's called. All right. So I want you to do the same. You don't have to do that for this challenge. I just wanted to point this out because it's early in our term together. And I wanted you to see what I'm going to be expecting down the road. Instead, today's challenge, go back through any of those slides that you want to watch or see, do some research on Google Earth, and complete your Arizona State Map Challenge. And like I said, you are welcome to work with a partner, and you can use external resources if you like. All right, historians, can't wait to talk to you next time about the people in ancient Arizona. Talk to you soon. Bye.